we'll have a 30-minute discussion from Tony Heller. Then we'll have a 10 minutes Q&A, and we'll ask people who have a question to come up to the microphone there. I'll remind people at the time, and then we'll have a 30-minute presentation by Tim Ball, and then again with a 10 minutes Q&A session afterwards, and then Senator Roberts might want to make a few comments, and then we'll move on to a more broader Q&A, which will go until the end of the evening at 10 p.m. The Q&As, the 10-minute Q&As, if you can focus on the presentation that just was, that would be much appreciated. Also, we would ask just one question from each person at each moment, and if you can, ask a question rather than to make a very long statement. And that's pretty much it for the night. I just wanted to hand it over to Senator Roberts. I just wanted to quote the great Sir Karl Popper, just in the theme of the night, when he said, "Good tests kill flawed theories." Over to you, Senator Roberts.
Thank you, Darren, and good evening, everyone, and welcome. I want to first of all welcome John Smead and Richard Pearson down the back. If you could stand up, please, fellas. They've come. Yeah, this is John Smead. They've both come from Noosa. Also want to welcome, in particular, Graham over here. Jeff Brown, sorry, not Graham, Jeff Brown. Stand up, Jeff. Oh, you are standing, sorry. He's the only person I can look in the eye. Also, stand up, Jim. Yes. And John McRae, who introduced me to many, stand up, mate. He introduced me to many of the concepts and solidified some of my understanding of the things that are driving this climate scam. Where's Viv Forbes? Please stand up, Viv. This is Viv Forbes. And everyone knows about Viv. I'm not going to say too much more, other than that he has been pushing for freedom all his life. All his life. And that is the big divide in Australian politics now. This left versus right is absolute nonsense. The real division is control versus freedom. And Viv has always been on the side of freedom. I'd like Peter Bobroff to stand up, please. He doesn't like being seen in the limelight. I'll talk a bit more about Peter's work in a minute. And also want to Mike Elliott to stand up, and Jim Simpson. They have been very, very strong fighters for freedom through this climate scam. And also Judy Ryan, if you could stand up, please. Judy's done amazing initiatives. And for all the others who I've forgotten, thank you very much, because we're going to meet in a minute a man, Tim Ball, who has kept this going for 40 years. This defense of freedom. He has been relentless, and he's suffered a lot, but we're going to introduce him. I also forgot to mention down the back, Howard Baker. Could you stand up, please, Howard? Howard has written a book that's excellent. I have yet to read it, but I'm told reliably that it's excellent. I also want to welcome an empty seat over here, because at that seat, it's empty because we invited the CSIRO to come and join us on this panel. It's there in case they change their mind. We also invited, correct me if I'm wrong, Sean, Greg Hunt, Mark Butler, Larissa Waters. Anyone else we miss? No, we invited only scientists and politicians, not academics who don't have science. The entire Senate. Are there any senators and members of the House of Reps here? Brian Burston. In my first Senate speech on Tuesday the 13th of September, I said, quote, "Australians should be able to rely on the information from Australian government bodies and institutions such as CSIRO, but we can't. And we certainly can't." I invited, the first thing I did after being sworn in as a senator was to go back immediately to my office and to invite the CSIRO Chief Executive, Dr. Larry Marshall, to make a presentation to me in 2 weeks' time. On the 2 days before, we hadn't had a response, 2 days before the 16th, so I asked him by phone if he'd be attending. his office said yes, they would be. The next day, the day before the presentation, they said they wouldn't be. We would have to contact the minister. So we chased a couple of ministers, and we eventually chased CSIRO down, and we met, even though they're based in Canberra. The first available time was 2.5 hours in Sydney. So we met them there, and they made a presentation to us. I asked them specifically for the empirical evidence. That's the measured data, the physical observations, the hard facts. What constitutes and decides science? And we wanted the evidence that proves human carbon dioxide affects global climate, and we wanted statistically significant evidence. We listened for 2.5 hours. All we did was ask clarifying questions. I said up front that we would not be debating, and they appreciated that and made their presentation. I can tell you quite clearly that they have no empirical evidence that carbon dioxide from human activity affects climate. We said that to the press gathered in here yesterday. I've presented a copy of my report electronically and hand-delivered it yesterday. So we are awaiting their response. The second thing that we learned from the CSIRO is that when we asked the question, and I asked it personally, what is there in the 2,000-year climate record that indicates imminent danger from human carbon dioxide? They refused to answer the question. Refused. I asked it again, nicely. They refused to answer the question. So we're in agreement, aren't we? There is no danger from carbon dioxide from human activity. The third thing we learned was that they contradict the empirical evidence on climate. The fourth thing we learned is that they have done no due diligence on the data they're using and relying upon from the Bureau of Meteorology. No due diligence. And you'll learn why that's significant tonight. I think you already worked it out. We have, in the last few years, wasted $10.2 billion on desalination plants based on a scare from academics like Tim Flannery and others. $10.2 billion based on a scare that the dams will never fill again. And as soon as the desal plants were built, the dams overflowed in most states. The Brisbane floods resulted from a panic in the Queensland government that compromised the Wivenhoe Dam based on a scare that we would have a never-ending drought. Lives were lost, billions of dollars were wasted. We have seen South Australia being destroyed due to renewable energy. Some people call them alternative energies. They're really alternatives to energy. And South Australia is now paying the price. They're rescued when necessary, which is often, by the Hazelwood Power Station in Victoria, which is going to be shut in 4 months. And that affects people in every state, because when Victorians run out of power, they will take it from New South Wales, which will do what to New South Wales power prices? So everyone in this room will pay more for electricity, a lot more. It's already being paid, we're already paying a lot more. The Barrier Reef, we're told, is being destroyed. The Barrier Reef, according to scientists and tour operators, is in the best shape it's been in a long time. Our Australian fishing industry, we are an island continent. We have a tiny population. By many measures, we have the world's biggest fishing zone. And yet we import almost 3/4 of the seafood we eat. Why? Because of the United Nations. That's why. Who are driving this scam, as Tim will explain. We have industry in Queensland and other states, and I'm a senator for Queensland, that are being shut and exported overseas. And when the manufacturing is overseas, they don't have the same high quality pollution standards, so the production of real pollutants, sulfur dioxide, nitrous oxides, particulates, globally has increased as a result of our greens policies. We are being devastated industrially. As Tony pointed out to me today, the South Australian government dynamited, if that's the word, exploded a power station and celebrated that just recently. What is the first thing an attacking enemy does to a country when it invades? It knocks out the energy sources. We are being destroyed from within. We have activists destroying Queensland, going ahead of the Adani coal mine. Those activists are funded by Americans close to the President of the United States and the potential future President of the United States, Hillary Clinton. We have seen forecasts in 2005 that predicted 50 million climate refugees due to sea level increases by the year 2010. 6 years later than that deadline, there have been 0 refugees due to climate. Forecast after forecast failed. CSIRO says there's no danger. They have no evidence for their claims. I'd like you to remember 3 key phrases: no danger, fabricated data, and groupthink. What I'm going to do now is introduce Tony Heller. Tony Heller is a scientist. He has qualifications in science. He also is an engineer. He has worked in research projects. He's worked forensically to investigate issues. And for the last 10 years, he's been holding NASA, or rather Goddard Institute of Space Studies, a tiny group within NASA, correct? And more particularly, a handful of NASA's people who record their temperature data. He has held them accountable relentlessly. And I'm going to introduce him in a minute to give his presentation. I also want to introduce, secondly, Tim Ball. Professor Tim Ball is a Canadian climatologist who I think is the best person in climate in the world. I've dealt with a lot of people on both sides of this discussion around the world, and Tim is head and shoulders above everyone. He not only understands climate, he understands weather, he understands the environment, he understands philosophy, he understands politics, he understands human behavior, he understands policies. He's a true Renaissance man. Remember one thing, the onus of proof that we are affecting climate is on the CSIRO. So with no further words, I'm going to introduce Tony Heller to give you a presentation on climate science.
Thank you very much, Senator Roberts. Oh, is that working? Okay. Yeah, thank you very much, Senator Roberts. This is my first trip to Australia, and I'm having a wonderful time here. Been spending my free time out photographing wildlife and getting some great pictures. We actually don't have koalas and parrots and things like this back in Colorado, so it's been great fun for me. So the title of my presentation is The Emperor's New Climate. So the story of the Emperor's New Clothes was a wonderful story about people blindly believing authority. There were 3 experts in the kingdom who said that the king was wearing fine new clothes, and nobody else could see them. And the king himself felt like he was not qualified to question these experts. And certainly the people who were working for the king didn't feel like they were qualified to question it. And the subjects in the kingdom, none of them believed that they were qualified either. So we went on with, everybody's looking at the king, everybody's seeing him naked, but they'd say, well, we've got these 3 top experts, 97% of the clothing experts in the kingdom said that the king was wearing fine new clothes, when in fact he was completely naked. Next, please. And so this sort of leads into one of my favorite quotes from Galileo. In questions of science, the authority of 1,000 is not worth the humble reasoning of a single individual. And in the case of the Emperor's New Clothes, who was that single individual? It was the small child who called out, the king's not wearing any clothes, right? Next. Okay, so this is a great newspaper article from the Brisbane Courier from 145 years ago titled Imaginary Changes of Climate. And basically it's making fun of all the hysteria in the press and everybody else who constantly thinks the climate is changing and all kinds of horrible things are happening. And this is a great quote from the article. Every season is sure to be extraordinary. Almost every month, one of the wettest, driest or wettest, windiest, coldest, hottest, whatever. Everything was always the worst it ever was. And it's as much observation which ought to correct a tendency to exaggerate seems in some minds to have rather a tendency to increase it. And that's exactly what we hear now, right? Every month we hear, this is the most hottest, driest, wettest, whatever month ever in the history of the climate. So this is not a new problem. People, it's a problem that's been afflicting people, and particularly people in the press, for a very long time. They want to report something historical. So yeah, this was the hottest month ever. This was the driest month ever. And this was an article from 1863, I believe, from the Empire in Sydney, detailing the history of droughts and floods going back to the 1780s. And as you can see, this is normal weather in Australia. You have droughts, then it switches to floods, and drought, flood. And I'm sure that every time you go through a long period, very dry period, or a long wet period, there's people who come to believe this is permanent. It's always going to be like this. We don't remember anything else. And then it switches back, and they switch their position. Well, now we're in flood all the time. But this is just normal weather. This is how climate works. Next. Okay, and I threw this slide in today because of Senator Roberts talking about no empirical evidence. This is a graphs that were published in the 1990 UN IPCC report, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And what it shows is, what I've highlighted in red is the recent warming, what was currently blamed on global warming. You'll notice that over a period of 10,000 years, it's almost nothing. It's well within the natural variability. And over the last 1,000 years, once again, we see the same thing. The medieval warm period was much warmer. They found Viking graves in Greenland that are pierced by trees in places where it's now the ground's completely frozen. So we know that it was very warm back during that period. But once again, the modern warming is well within the realm of natural variability. So we don't know what caused this warming in the past, and we certainly can't say that this warming is empirical evidence, because it certainly isn't. It's just noise in a long-term pattern of natural climate change. Next. Okay, this is more no empirical evidence. The blue lines represent actual measured troposphere temperatures from the satellite. Troposphere is the part of the atmosphere where we live. And the yellow is climate models. As you can see, the climate models have consistently overestimated warming. And we use models to develop policy, and these models have shown to not be very skillful in the past. So we're making policy based on models which are no good, and it's not empirical evidence. Next one. Okay, so now what really got me interested in the work that Senator Roberts doing was this guy here, BBC presenter, Brian Cox. He comes and holds up this graph and says, "I brought the graph." And then he implied that anyone who doesn't believe this means the end of the world probably also believes that NASA never actually landed men on the moon. And that struck me as being rather remarkable, because I happen to know some of the people who went to the moon, and they have a very different opinion about this. So, next, please. So my senator from New Mexico at the time, Harrison Schmitt, is the only scientist who ever walked on the moon. He's a Harvard PhD in geology, great guy, and he's a very well-known climate skeptic. So 100% of scientists, moonwalkers, agree with Senator Roberts and disagree with Brian Cox. A unanimous consensus. Okay, next. Okay, and additionally, 49 of the top people from the Apollo program sent a letter to the NASA administrator saying, "You guys have got to stop this. We did a lot of good work for you. We gave this agency a great reputation. And you've got these people over at the Goddard Institute for Space Studies who are doing this garbage work. They're embarrassing the agency, and we're ruining our reputation." So it was a great thing for Professor Cox to do, to bring this up because he was exactly on the wrong side of it. Okay, next please. Okay, so now the other half of that picture of Brian Cox, well, he's obviously has a lot more hair than me, so he's got one big advantage than me. But he pointed this graph from NASA showing how temperatures have been going, increasing steadily for the last 100 years or so. And this is something which I have a lot of expertise in. I've been studying the history of government temperature graphs. So the U.S. Government Climate Lab is the National Center for Atmospheric Research in Boulder, Colorado, where I live. I ride my bike up there just about every day. Great place. And in 1974, they published this graph, which showed no warming from 1870 to 1970. You can see down there at the bottom, National Center for Atmospheric Research. And what's particularly interesting about this is that there was a lot of warming to about 1940, and then a very strong cooling where essentially all of the prior warming had been lost by 1970. Okay, next please. Okay, this is a very similar graph put out by the U.S. National Academy of Sciences in 1975. You see the same pattern, a lot of warming in 1940, a lot of cooling, and temperatures in 1970 were no warmer than they were in 1880. Okay, next please. But now if we look at the current NASA graph, I just took this off the NASA website a couple of days ago. I want to make clear that I'm just talking about land temperatures in all of these graphs. This is the NASA land temperature graph. We no longer see that post-1940 cooling. It's disappeared. So we had NCAR, National Academy of Sciences, many other studies that were done 40 years ago showed cooling after 1940, but now NASA no longer shows any of this. And this is very troubling. Okay, and this one I've overlaid the National Academy of Sciences graph in black with the NASA graph in red. They're at identical scales on both axes. You can see how NASA has completely removed the post-1940 cooling. Next, please. All right. And this is one of my favorite ClimateGate emails from Tom Wigley to Phil Jones at CRU. It would be good to remove at least part of the 1940s blip, but we were still left with why the blip. So they made a decision. They wanted to remove this blip here, this 1940s blip, and they didn't even have any reason to do it at the time. And oh wait, go back, please. And this graph was 1981, graph generated by James Hansen, and the red graph is their current NASA graph. Once again, these are identical scale on both axes. So you can see how they've greatly cooled the past since 1981. And James Hansen was the guy who started this whole big climate scare. That was his black graph up there. So they've cooled temperatures substantially over the last 35 years. Next, please. Okay. In 1989, Tom Karl, who was the longtime head of NOAA's National Climatic Data Center in the United States, he just retired a couple weeks ago. He said that while global cooling actually warmed overall since 1881, it cooled from 1921 to 1979. And he said almost all of the warming occurred before 1919. And then there was this cooling from 1921 to 1979. Next, please. Now, on this graph, I've drawn this line here showing the current NASA 1921 to 1979. They now show about 0.6 C warming during that same period when Tom Karl, who's also become a top alarmist, said that the Earth was cooling in 1989. Very troubling once again. Okay, so did this post-1940 to 1970 cooling actually occur? Well, this was an article from the New York Times in 1961. It says there was unanimous agreement among Assembly of Specialists on Climate Change from several continents that the Earth was cooling. So every single scientist who studied the problem in the 1960s believed that the Earth was cooling, and NASA no longer shows it cooling. Next, please. Okay, this was in 1970, the U.S. and Russia, this was reported in the New York Times again, were very worried about why the Arctic was getting so cold. The ice was becoming ominously thicker. and whether this was going to lead to another ice age. So clearly the Earth was cooling at this time. Okay, this was 1979. NOAA said it was indisputable that the Earth had been cooling since World War II. Once again, all this cooling has been erased. The top guy at NOAA said that it had cooled down about 0.5 degree Celsius, which is what was seen in the NCAR graph and the National Academy of Sciences graph. Okay, and there we go again. Where's that cooling? It's gone now. It's no longer there in the NASA graph. I mean, anyone who's not troubled by this sort of change should be. Okay, so Gavin Schmidt conveniently put a tool up on his website, on the NASA website, where we can actually see the changes that have been made in different versions of NASA graphs. So this is their 2000 version. They had about 0.5 C warming, which is represented by the red there. Okay, next please. This is the 2012 version. It's gone from 0.5 C warming up to 0.9 C warming. Next. Okay, and now they show about 1.4 C warming. So basically NASA has tripled the total amount of global warming since the year 2000. Okay, so you might ask the question, well, maybe the Earth just warmed a lot since the year 2000. And once again, okay, this line here shows what satellites show has happened over land over the last 16 years. They show that temperatures have either been flat or they've declined slightly. And at the same time, NASA temperatures, land temperatures, show a very strong warming trend. There's this huge divergence. So we keep hearing about all these record temperatures we're having. Well, they're not being measured in the troposphere, and that's where the greenhouse effect occurs, is in the troposphere, right? So I don't know, NASA's taking temperatures in parking lots or what, but this warming is not occurring in the troposphere that NASA's reporting. And if it's not occurring in the troposphere, it's not global warming, because that's what global warming theory depends on, is that tropospheric warming, not parking lot warming. Okay, my specialty, what I've really focused on mostly, has been the U.S. temperature record. The U.S. has the best and most contiguous, most complete temperature record in the world. It's all available on the NOAA website. The blue line shows what their actual measured temperature date is. And as you can see, temperatures in the United States have actually cooled some over the last 80 to 90 years. But the red line is what they publish in their graphs. They show this strong warming trend during that time. The entire reason why why NOAA shows a U.S. warming trend is because they've altered the data. And, they don't dispute that they do this. But what they don't do is, they put out a graph of U.S. temperatures. What they don't do is they don't put a disclaimer on it saying, this data has been altered. The actual data says that we're cooling. Right? So they've got a small group of people, just, a handful of people who have made this unilateral decision. We're going to ignore the actual data which shows the U.S. cooling. We're going to turn it into a warming trend. And this is just not how we do science. And it's very deceptive. They should, at least if they're going to do this, publish the raw temperature graph too, but they never do. You'll never see a raw temperature graph from NOAA. They're hiding this information from the American people. They're hiding it from our policymakers. And policy is being made based on data which is very, very dodgy, and data techniques that are very dodgy. So it's quite upsetting to me. Okay, so this, once again, going back to Tom Carl, who was head of the NCDC until a few weeks ago in 1989. This is an article from the New York Times. U.S. data since 1895 failed to show warming trend. Scientists from NOAA said that said that there's no significant change in the average temperature or rainfall in the United States over the past century, which means no climate change, right? So NOAA was saying not that long ago there was no climate change in the United States, and now they show a lot of climate change during that period. Next. Okay, and this one I threw in, it's not just temperature data that's being altered, okay? That This is sea level data here. You see the NASA 1982 line? Once again, that was James Hansen, the world's top climate alarmist. He showed that sea level rise, this is global sea level rise, almost stopped after the year 1955. This blue line here is the current NASA CSIRO graph. NASA is now taking their data from CSIRO. And instead of showing sea level slowing down to almost nothing, they show it accelerating now. And the 1982 James Hansen graph showed 1 centimeter of sea level rise from 1955 to 1980. And now they're showing 5 centimeters of sea level rise. Sea level rise is not that hard a thing to measure. But what they've done is what the CSIRO guys and NASA guys have done. They've started cherry picking stations that are land that's subsiding. So the land's going down, and yeah, it looks like sea level's going up. And NOAA, interestingly enough, shows much slower rates, and they don't. If you look at the NOAA graphs, NOAA has a very complete set of sea level graphs. I don't think you can find one single station which shows that sort of pattern in there. Okay, so this one here, I just want to digress a little bit. This is going back to an article from the Maitland Mercury from 1846, where the Aborigines were talking about huge amounts of climate change in Australia and blaming it on other people. Okay, next. Okay, this is another one of my favorite articles from the U.S. Monthly Weather Review from 1907. It says the misuse of meteorological data is a crime against the community, and it's up to the independent press, bloggers, I guess, to repress all climate cheats and hoaxes. And I've sort of seen that as been my role here. Okay, so in summary of the first part here, Brian Cox held up a graph which has been massively altered. The people at NASA who generated the graph had nothing to do with the moon landings. The people who did go to the moon agree with Senator Roberts, not with Brian Cox. I'd say Brian Cox made a very clumsy appeal to authority and apparently did no research to back it up. And history is not on the side of climate alarmists. Okay, next one. Okay, so who are these experts we've been listening to about climate? Okay, Paul Ehrlich, in 1997, came to us. He's an American from California, from Stanford University. He came to Australia and attacked the Howard government over their stance on climate change. And of course, it was widely reported all over about how evil the Australians were because they weren't going to take care of climate change for the future. Okay, and the same guy, Paul Ehrlich, in 1970, he said that the oceans would be dead and America would run out of food and water by 1980. The guy's kind of a whack job, but he got published in all the Australian papers as attacking the Howard government over this. Next. Okay, but this guy gets worse. In 1969, he was published in the New York Times as promoting poisoning people in Africa in order to keep the population down. And then in 1990, he also said he not only wanted to kill off the poor people, he also wanted to kill off the rich people too. And this guy was quoted as being a climate expert in 1997. Okay, James Hansen, the world's #1 climate alarmist, he predicted in 1988 that lower Manhattan would be underwater sometime between the years 2008 and 2018. He said the West Side Highway will be underwater, it'll be taped across the windows, the birds will all be gone. I was in Manhattan recently. I didn't notice any of those things, but might have been mistaken. And this is the actual NOAA tide gauge data from Manhattan for the last 20 years. You notice there's been no net change in sea level in Manhattan for 20 years now. So it's not only not underwater, but nothing has changed. Yeah, this is James Hansen, the most respected climate alarmist in the world. He doesn't know what he's talking about. Okay, this is a great sequence from the New York Times in 1969. On February 20th, 1969, the New York Times predicted that the North Pole, that the Arctic would be ice-free by 1989 at the latest. And then 3 days later, literally 3 days later, they predicted a new ice age. All the news that's fit to print, I guess. Okay, in 1989, the top UN climate experts said we only had until the year 2000 to stop global warming, then we were all going to die. And I think we survived so far. In 2004, the UK's government's chief scientist said we were all going to have to move to Antarctica because it was going to be too hot to live anywhere else. Last time I checked, it was like 100 below zero in Antarctica. Okay, in 2012, the UK Environment Secretary said drought may be, this was in The Guardian, my favorite paper, drought may be the new norm for the UK, says the Environment Secretary. About 3 weeks later, it started flooding and hasn't quit since then. Okay. In 2009, David Jones from BOM said, Southeast Australia, permanent drought. I was out photographing it. It looked pretty green to me for a permanent drought. Okay, so my conclusion is blindly accepting consensus or authority like Brian Cox did not science. There's that Galileo quote. And this is the Richard Feynman quote, which is the theme of my blog. Science is the belief in the ignorance of the experts. That's it. Thank you.
That was a fantastic presentation. I've been following, I've been a climate change or global warming skeptic since I first looked at ideas for a carbon tax in the mid-90s in Australia. And the people on the other side have never really, met the burden of proof. So that actually was just one of the best presentations I have seen. My point is, in all this time, that's just one of the best presentations I've seen. Definitely. Thank you very much. To kick off the sort of 10 minutes thereabouts of Q&A, I'll remind everybody, if you don't know, that this broadcast is going live on Facebook at the moment, and we're getting questions from Facebook and Twitter, I believe. So to kickstart it off, before anybody wants to come up to the microphone in the center to ask a question, this is a question from Adam Moorhurst for you, Tony. What does NASA have to gain by altering temps?
Funding. There has to, in order for, I grew up in a scientific community in Los Alamos, New Mexico, and there's always this push to find projects which create a need for scientists, right? If we have global warming going on, then scientists are needed, right? We need these scientists to solve the problem for us. Therefore, we can get money from Congress if it's global cooling. Every time we saw a new administration come in Los Alamos and a new president coming in, we would see a huge change in priorities. Suddenly something else would become a new problem. Jimmy Carter, I worked for Jimmy Carter on oil shale. It was his moral equivalent of war. Then Reagan didn't like Carter's oil shale thing, so he bagged that and went to Star Wars. Suddenly Russians were going to blow us up with missiles. And it just changes all the time. So scientists, they have to find things to make themselves relevant. They have to find important issues to bring the funding in. So I think that's a very simple question. If the government wanted to pay for global cooling, I guarantee you NASA would find global cooling.
Could I just add a little bit to that? Because I watched this in my career. It used to be publish or perish. As you know, that was the dictum in universities. But then starting in about the late 60s and early 70s, governments, because of economy and cutbacks, they were reducing funding to universities. And the universities looked at the situation and realized that academics that were bringing in funding could be a source of income for the universities. And the argument was quite reasonable. They said, hey, we're providing you with office space, heat and light, and all the rest of it. You should have to pay for that. And so they started taking, and it was early, it was 20%, and now it's about 35, 40% off the top of any research fund that any academic on campus brought in. And so the academics bringing in the funding became far more valuable than any of the research they were doing. That was the shift. And as you know, one of the, I'll talk in a minute about my lawsuit, but one of the big things that was going on with Michael Mann at Penn State was he was bringing in very, very large amounts of funding. And therefore the president of the university and the vice president set about defending him because of the amount of money that was involved. So that was a sort of a local effect that had on the funding. The funding became, so you became important if you were, and I raised the question, by the way, what if you're studying philosophy? How do you get funding and contribute to the university? And it really changed the whole of academia as I saw it.
Thank you. Would anybody like to ask a question? Yeah, would you come up to the microphone, please? And if you can, sorry, just if you can state your name, you can stay in association if you want to, but at least your name would be helpful.
Yes. I'm John Morland, and thank you, Steve, for that great talk. You can fool some of the people all the time. You can fool all the people, some of the people all the time, all the people some of the time, but not all the people all the time. How long can this nonsense keep going before people start realizing that, according to some prediction later on, that the whole predictions are all these altered will show a retrospective ice age, and people suddenly wake up to say, hang on, this is a pile of you know what. How long will this nonsense go for?
I think that the whole concept of climate change, I think, was sort of created because it's something which there's really people personal experience, they don't really have any way of knowing. I suppose if sea level actually came up and Manhattan drowned, then people would be able to say, yes, I've been affected by climate change. But we're not actually seeing those sort of things going on. So people just go back to just relying on whatever authority tells them, right? They say all the polar bears are dying, even though it's not true. So we keep getting, it's all completely reliant on what authority tells them. It's the emperor's new clothes story. It keeps going on till some child screams out, hey, that's a bunch of nonsense.
It's a very, very good question, and I addressed it at a presentation I made about a month ago, because all the polls are showing that this is not an issue for the public. The United Nations poll of 8 million people listed their top 16 concerns, and climate change was 16th. The Pew Center polls, which cover all social concerns in the United States, and climate change was 32nd on the list. Yeah, so that's the question that's interesting, is why, if it's not a concern to the public, do the politicians keep it bubbling and boiling? And of course the politicians, there's two reasons, I think. One is that they are still terrified of being accused of not being green, right? So they're being eco-bullied is the term I like to use for them. And the other thing is there's far too many politicians see a great benefit in carbon taxes. And there's no politician that ever ignored a good chance for a tax. And so I think those are two of the major factors that are keeping it going. And I'm going to show you a graph where a study was done by Yale University amongst the general public and it was done as a grade 10 American high school test. And 75% failed it. So the public don't understand, don't know, don't want to know, and therefore just, really are not concerned. I think that what Malcolm's doing here with getting the politicians involved and then showing, and by the way, one of the hardest things we're going to have to do is people don't want to believe that bureaucrats or scientists would cook the books. That's a very hard sell. So what Malcolm's doing is, the only reason I came down here was because I think that this is the start of getting the politicians to accept what's going on by showing how they're being lied to by their own bureaucrats. And I'll elaborate on that when I give my talk, but those are the basic answers I see.
One more question live from Facebook, from Les Cat, and this is addressed specifically to Tony. In 2003, you believed that CO2 caused global warming. What happened that made you to become skeptical of the AGW hypothesis?
I've worked on radiative transfer models for the National Center for Atmospheric Research, and I personally do believe that carbon dioxide does cause global warming. I just believe that it's a very small amount, which is what the models show. You get a significant amount of global warming from carbon dioxide over about the first 40 parts per million, but after that it tails off quite a bit. And additional increases are quite small. And there was actually a study done by NASA's top scientists, Rasool and Schneider, in 1971, widely published study, which explained why you can only get a limited amount of global warming, and their words were, the runaway greenhouse effect is impossible.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'd like to add something to that. I've inquired of a lot of scientists about the effect of carbon dioxide. And what I've seen is that there are many different groups. and many different individuals. Some believe that carbon dioxide from human activity only will have a catastrophic effect someday, sometime. There's another group that speaks, as Tony does, that carbon dioxide has a limited warming effect and then tails off or disappears and is offset by natural negative forces. Then there is another group of people, and the scientists, these are credentialed physicists, eminent physicists, who say that carbon dioxide has only a cooling effect. There are others who say that other scientists who say that carbon dioxide in a small quantity, as Tony just said, has a warming effect, and beyond that, has a cooling effect. You'll notice we invited Tony here, even though he said that he believes carbon dioxide has a warming effect at low levels of carbon dioxide. Because the fundamental thing of science is to have an open discussion and a debate and settle it by empirical evidence. That's it. We don't mind people disagreeing. We want them to show us the facts.
Yeah, let me add something to that. So I grew up in Los Alamos, and my father would take me to colloquiums at the laboratory where they'd get people who get up, and these scientists would get up and they'd start shouting at each other and have very vigorous arguments and debate. And it was great. It was wonderful. These sort of disagreements are what move science forward. And what's been so disturbing about this climate debate is that one side has just silenced the other side. We get the press who refuses to listen to one side. So we're only getting one story. We're not getting this vigorous, aggressive argument, which we need to have in order to resolve this issue. It's been completely cut off.
I believe we have 2 more questions from the audience.
Yeah.
Doug Cotton, I'm the author of a book, Why It's Not Carbon Dioxide After All, and various papers. I think a few people know my name. But when it comes to the issue as to whether greenhouse gases warm or cool that we've just been discussing, one very clear way of looking into this is to see what happens with different levels of water vapour. We can already see, because water vapour varies between about 1% and 4%, we can already see the effect of more greenhouse gas water vapour in moist areas. And I did a very comprehensive study of about 30 years of temperature data from 15 locations on 3 different continents, and very clearly water vapour cooled. The more moist regions had both lower daily minimum temperatures and maximum temperatures than the warmer ones. There's a little graph in my book, and you probably can't see it from a distance, but you can more or less get the trend that the lower third, the more moist ones were cooler. And what the IPCC is saying is that because of its radiation effect, they're effectively saying that water vapour does most of 33 degrees of warming. And, if an average of 1.25% did even say 15 degrees, what does 4% do? 60 degrees in a rainforest? So we have very clear evidence that greenhouse gases cool. And I've made what I believe is a major discovery of what I call a heat creep process that explains why this is the case based on the laws of physics. All I can say, it's there on my website, whyitsnotco2.com. People can read it. Over 95,000 people have visited my websites and no one has ever proved it wrong. So I just say to you, I believe that we have to attack their physics. The sun does not warm the surface. It's 168 watts per metre squared can only create minus 40 degrees. They add back radiation twice as much, overestimated, and think they can put the two together into a Stefan Boltzmann calculation and explain the surface, but you just can't do that in physics. And things like Wien's displacement law, prove that you can't. And an understanding of Planck functions and Stefan Boltzmann being integrals of Planck functions. Anyone who's done 3 years of physics in a standard university should be able to prove them wrong. And I believe we just need to focus on what's wrong here, and any hypothesis that doesn't obey the laws of physics, as theirs does not, there's no point in even looking any further.
No, that's an excellent point. Does anybody want to address that, or?
Well, we
can move on to the next question if you don't.
We appreciate that. We had a fairly large range of opinions about physics, and I think we sort of decided to avoid trying to talk about that in this particular discussion, but it's certainly a discussion that it would be appropriate for some forum, and something that needs to be done.
And I think it also speaks to the point, sorry, that Tony made earlier, that there have been no open discussions. Sure. I mean, surely one of the lessons from ClimateGate was the suppression of other scientists. When they were able to get an editor of a national journal fired because he published an article they didn't like, that gives you a measure of thing. And I can tell you the number of rejections I've had for articles is far longer than the number that I actually got published. And this control of, and the playing of the game, it's got to be peer reviewed. And then they were peer reviewing each other's paper, and then they were deciding whose name was going to go on an article to pad out their curriculum vitae and so on. The degree to which the people at the CRU who were in control of the IPCC controlled the whole of climate science is truly frightening. And if you go and look at the Journal of Climatology, which they set up, and all of the editors of it were all members of the IPCC and at CRU. So if they wanted an article put out there quickly to counteract something that had come out, bang, it was out within months. I mean, it was just frightening. So the degree of corruption of the climate science that I've witnessed is really, really frightening. And so there has been no debate. The last point I'll make is that effectively what we're talking about, they use the term climate sensitivity. And what I want to point out to you is that the level of climate sensitivity, that is the amount of CO2 effect on global temperature, has consistently decreased, even at the IPCC. And there are now, as I said, it's approaching below 1 degree Celsius and pushing towards 0. So there is a change going on. But as I said, it's hampered by, and I'll just finish with one last point. Look at the role of science and nature, the two preeminent science journals in the climate science area. I mean, it was so political that it is really, really disturbing.
Just one more question, then we'll move on to Professor Ball's presentation.
Malcolm, my name's Dr. Brady. I got out a book this year called Mirrors and Mazes, A Guide to the Climate Debate. I'm making a comment, Ian, that you may like to comment on, and that is sea level, which you mentioned. The IPCC in 1994, Professor Warwick and Earlman said only linear level rise in sea level, no acceleration whatsoever. It was acceleration only turned up when the Jason satellite series was put up, and that is now managed by the University of Colorado that are defending that, etc. But I have been corresponding with the head of the satellite design team at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, Dr. Yoaz Bar-Serva. He got out a paper to say there's errors in the Jason system. He wants to put up a new satellite but can't get the money, called GRASP. So I don't think that NASA's a monolithic body on this, and I think a lot of people in NASA are very worried about the exaggeration of the Jason series, because over Sydney it's out 300%, over Germany 200%. And the CSIRO started to push that in 2007, 2014, whereas earlier they were concerned there were altimetry problems and instrumentation problems in that satellite. If you would like to make some comments on that.
Well, that's really interesting information. Thanks for bringing it to my attention. I usually describe my hometown of Boulder, Colorado as being the epicenter of climate fraud. So I'm glad to hear that there's some people doing good work there. Oh, it was JP. Okay, wasn't Boulder. Oh, okay. Well, I love Boulder, but the amount of climate nonsense that comes out of my hometown is pretty remarkable.
Now on to Professor Ball.
Before Tim takes the microphone, I just want to acknowledge Craig Kelly has turned up. You might want to stand up, Craig. I know many people in this room have a lot of regard for Craig. A lot of people in this room have a lot of regard for Craig, and Pauline Hanson was here and had to leave. Her senior advisor came in and she had to leave. So I want to acknowledge Pauline for coming up also. I also want to mention, before Tim takes over, that Tony Heller came here at his own expense. I offered him the opportunity to speak and he paid for his own airfare down. And yeah, because he's passionate about science. And before anyone accuses Tim Ball of taking money from I don't know who, I paid for his airfare to come down. So, and he's paying for his own accommodation here. That's the way skeptics work. We help each other out because no one else does. No oil companies, no government funding, no university. We look after ourselves. So thank you, Tim.
I like to think that James Hansen retired from NASA GIS because their offices are in downtown Manhattan, and he was afraid he was going to get flooded out there. I'll just bring you up to date, by the way, on my legal situation. I know a lot of you are interested in that. And of course, the lawsuits against me are classified as SLAP lawsuits, which is an acronym for Strategic Lawsuits Against Public Participation. To give you an idea of how bizarre this has become, the author Mark Stein was sued by Michael Mann. Stein immediately sued back. And the American founding fathers in their wisdom said, let's stop frivolous lawsuits. That is, that if you're sued, you can fire it right back. Under the British system, you can't. All you can do is move for dismissal, and that's my problem. But Mann, of course, is now trying to counter Mark Stein's lawsuit by getting the courts to rule it as a SLAP lawsuit. If that isn't irony, I don't know what is. But anyway, I've had 3 lawsuits, all from the same lawyer, funded by the David Suzuki Foundation out of British Columbia. And you know, he came here and made a fool of himself on your television. The first lawsuit was by Gordon McBean, who was the Assistant Deputy Minister of Environment Canada. And he was the person who chaired the founding meeting of the IPCC at Villach, Austria in 1985. And I didn't think the article was particularly defamatory or anything else, but it was the first shot across the bow, if you want. My wife and I sat down and said, no, we can't afford to fight this. And of course, that's the problem with the law. The cost of it is just prohibitive. And so we said, no, we're not going to fight. I withdrew the article. And then I had an interview with Andrew Weaver, who some of you may know has been on 4 of the IPCC reports. In fact, is one of the lead authors in the climate modeling. And so he brought a lawsuit against me. And then about 9 days later, I was in Winnipeg, Manitoba, Canada, gave a talk on the hockey stick and Michael Mann. And afterwards, I was asked by somebody, what do you think about Michael Mann? And I flippantly said, well, he's at Penn State, but he should be at State Penn. And within 9 hours, I had another lawsuit on my hands. I am not looking for your help financially, because I've had help from all over the world. And you'd be encouraged to know that I've had people say, we're giving you money. We don't totally agree with what you say, but God damn it, you got the right to say it. And that is really encouraging. I can tell you, I'm in preparation now for my trial with Michael Mann. It's February 20th in Vancouver, British Columbia. Legal bills are already at $1.1 million. So it gives you an idea of how this is being used to silence people. And what we've done, my lawyer initially, and of course one of the problems is finding a lawyer that understood science. That was the first. And so what I did was I asked him, because I knew from my own students, how did you do in taxation in second year? That's the course most lawyers fail, because they don't know numbers, okay? He said, I loved it, did well. Okay, fine, you're my lawyer. He didn't agree with my view on climate at the start. Never said it specifically, but I knew he didn't believe. He's now totally committed, okay? And here's what's happened. Michael Mann took me to court with defamation. And initially, we were just going to defend it by proving that the medieval warm period did exist. That was the whole point. The hockey stick got rid of it, and we were going to bring the evidence. We have now switched that, because my view is, you give me the courtroom, I'm going to use it. So now we're going to go to a 30-day trial, and we're going to bring all experts from across the world. And I've had Nobel Prize winners coming, and we're going to put the whole of the global warming issue on trial in a court in Vancouver. And of course, and as I said, it was very nice of Mr. Mann to give me that opportunity. So we're pressing ahead full steam. And the way it works in Canada is that the experts, their list of credentials simply says they're an expert. But what we get them to do is write a brief of what they're going to speak to on the defamatory thing. They then come and speak to that in the courtroom. And I said we had very positive results. But no, I've seen no interference from the government. I've had interference from the government before, and certainly they would never consider me for the IPCC. But no, there's no political interference. I'll talk about the role of that in just a minute. And I make no apologies. This is going to be some information a lot of you already know. But don't forget, we've got Facebook. We've got people out there that need to know the whole picture, because the first question that comes to your mind after you listen to Tony is, well, why would scientists cook the books? What's the motive? And that was the inferred question here. And of course, the answer is that because once you tell a lie, you either admit you told a lie or you got to tell more lies. Right? You've got to keep the cover-up going, and that's, of course, one of the reasons that we're here tonight. So the human-caused global warming, if we can push the button there we go, the biggest deception in history. A lot of people call it a hoax. It's not a hoax. A hoax is designed to prick pomposity in the academic world, and it's a sort of a humorous thing. There's nothing funny about what they're doing here. The cost of lives and money and opportunities is just truly frightening. If you go to the next. Society shifts by paradigm shifts, that whole new ideas come up and societies either accept them or reject them. What happens, and I've studied this throughout history, is that there are a few people that will grab the new paradigm and use it for its political or its financial potential for themselves. Okay, and we saw that with the extreme environmentalists and grabbing a hold of environmentalism. The question, of course, the problem is that for the majority of people, like with environmentalism, say, well, that's a good idea, but how far do we go with it? And I like to use the example of feminism, another paradigm shift. And a lot of people, yeah, great ideas, but the women were saying, well, how far do we go? And I finally figured out the role of an extremist in society. Because the role of the extremist is to start doing crazy things with that new paradigm so that people are looking on, no, now you're going too far. In other words, the extremist has defined the limits. That's where we are now with the world. That's why the people are silent out there. Because they're starting to hear stupid things, and even they're saying, it's that lovely old, I was raised in Wiltshire in England, born near Stonehenge. Whenever it said religion on the form, I put Druid. Nobody's ever questioned it. But there's a lovely old saying in the west of England that said, I'm not as green as I am cabbage looking. Right? Which, of course, is what the public are starting to say about a lot of these issues now. They're starting to question. Environmentalism, and this is the big attack, and I know Tony's had the same thing. People saying, oh, you don't care about the planet, you don't care about the future, you don't care about the children. I can tell you I've done more than most extreme environmentalists that I know of. I set up soil conservations, chaired hazardous waste committees for the city of Winnipeg, and so on and so forth. But what's happening now amongst the young people, and I talk to schools, I've taught for 25 years, environmentalism is changing. It's become a religion. It's taken a whole religious component to it. And of course, that makes it even more difficult to challenge, because the climate change is just a subset of environmentalism, right? It's big in itself, but it's really just a subset of the whole idea of environmentalism. Okay, now, Thomas Malthus, and by the way, these essays on population, Darwin took a copy of that on the Beagle with him. He thought Malthus was absolutely right. And there's some interesting undercurrents in here because Darwin had a cousin by the name of Galton, who's the guy that created the term eugenics. So you had all of those things about population and control of population, all those ideas kicking around at the same time. Malthus said the population would outgrow the food supply. Of course, that was absolutely wrong. And if you go and look at what Malthus did, the examples he said, oh, look at America, look at the population growing there and the food supply. Of course, he ignored the fact that there was huge migration into the United States at the time. So it's just terrible, terrible science. So if we list, just keep clicking through, population would outgrow food supply. And then there was a group called the Club of Rome that formed in 1968. And they decided that Malthus was right, but they extended it, so the population would outgrow all resources because of industrial development. That became the central theme of what we're dealing with today, that there are too many people in the planet, each person is using too many resources, particularly the industrialized nations. So they became the focus. Because one of the questions that I try to get the public to ask themselves is, why the focus on CO2? It's all those other gases. Why CO2 become the focus? And it's one of those sort of obvious questions that's so obvious you don't think to ask it. Well, of course, we then got the population issue is really the underlying issue here. And Tony brought in Paul Ehrlich's. I can't believe he's still got a job. This is absolutely amazing. Yeah. There's hope for me yet. But Ehrlich was publishing books with this guy, John Holdren. And the book they published was together was Ecoscience, Population, Resources, Environment. Okay, John Holdren is today Obama's science czar. Okay, he's the guy that created the term polar vortex, which is we knew about cold air flowing out of the Arctic or Antarctic. There's nothing new. He just gave it a new term. And he created the term, so he went from global warming to climate change to climate disruption. Because he started to realize that people were saying, well, climate changes all the time. Oh, we were talking about climate disruption. Oh, well, if it's a disruption, it's interfering with natural processes. Ergo, it must be something humans are doing. That's the thinking that's going on here. And here's a quote from that book. And it underlines how these people operate. John Holdren wrote, indeed, it has been concluded that compulsory population control laws, even including laws requiring compulsory abortion, could be sustained under the existing Constitution if the population crisis became sufficiently severe to endanger the society. Let me dissect that for you for a minute. It has been concluded. Who concluded that? Who's the it? And the answer is they did. They concluded it's a problem, right? So this is setting up the straw man. And then it says that even including laws could be sustained under the existing Constitution if the population crisis became sufficiently severe. Who decides that? They do. So they set up the problem and they determine the parameters for when they invoke the necessary activities to stop the endangering of society. And I'll show you that idea comes up again in the climate issue in just a minute. Okay, of course, out of that came the first very simplistic computer model, use of computer model in resources, the limits to growth. It was grossly simple linear trends. And by the way, this is the book where peak oil became a big issue, that here's the amount of resource, we're using it at this rate, therefore we're going to run out at this point, or we'll reach the peak of its use at this point. So limits to growth, as I said, was the preamble really to the computer models of the IPCC. The Club of Rome, 1994, the president of it, Alexander King, the first global revolution. And of course, the use of the word revolution is very important. In searching for a new enemy to unite us, we came up with the idea that pollution, the threat of global warming, water shortages, famine, and the like would fit the bill. What they needed was something that was threatening the whole world. Because what they knew was that they couldn't get all the nation states to go along. You can see that with Kyoto, and you can see it with the Paris Accord, the Green Climate Fund, and so on. So they wanted something, and global warming, of course, fit the bill very nicely. Next slide. And here's the guy. I'm ashamed to say he's Canadian. He's not with us anymore. This is Maurice Strong. And I want everybody in the world to get to know this guy and know of him. I talked to people that went to school with him, that grew up with him in Canada, worked for him, worked against him, and so on. He was the most manipulative person, incredibly manipulative, but a superb organizer, particularly of bureaucracies. And of course that, and I'll build on this theme a little bit later, but Mary McCarthy, American social commentator, said, bureaucracy, the rule of no one, the modern form of despotism. And of course it's through the bureaucracies that these things are being achieved. So Maurice Strong, oh sorry, back to that one. In a book called The Cloak of Green, written by Elaine Dewar, and a superb piece of journalism, she started out a book. She wanted to praise all the Canadian environmentalists, David Suzuki, Elizabeth May. The more research she did, the more she found these people were more corrupt than the corporations they were attacking. And so she then wrote a book condemning these people. And sorry, back to the previous one. This is the key phrase here. Isn't the only hope for the planet the industrialized nation collapse? Isn't it our responsibility to bring that about? And I want you to ask yourself, how would you do that? It's all very well to have these ideas, but to actually implement them, right? It's very, very difficult challenge. And of course the answer is, if you think about the industrialized nation, which of course is using the resources at a far greater rate than anybody else and therefore has to be shut down, think about the industrialized nation as the engine in a car. You can stop the engine of the car by squeezing the fuel line. Well, if you did that with a nation, people would scream right away. Just look at what happens when there's fuel shortages somewhere. Right, yeah. But you can also stop an engine by plugging the exhaust. That will stop the engine too. So if you can show that the byproduct of the burning of the fossil fuels is causing runaway global warming, then you've got a way of stopping the industrialized nation. So that's why CO2 became the gas of concern and focus. Okay, well then, once you've got that, what do? Next one. And by the way, Dewar reached this conclusion in her book. Strong was using the UN as a platform to sell a global environment crisis and the global governance agenda. There it is, right there. Okay, next one. And here's how he set it up. He set up the United Nations Environment Program, the Rio Declaration 1992. And I'm going to come back to that year 1992 a little bit later on, because he also took over control of all of the energy production in the province of Ontario in that same year. Ontario, he took it from being one of the most powerful, energy-supported provinces in Canada. It is now in desperation. The citizens of Ontario are going to be paying for 40 years for what he did in that province. That's the same year he set up the Rio Declaration. He set up the political side of it, Agenda 21, of course, the Conference of the Parties. That's the political body that makes the decisions. On the scientific side, of course, he used the World Meteorological Organization to set up the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Why? Because if he could control the national weather bureaus, CSIRO, BOM, or NOAA, then he had direct access to the politicians. Because the politicians are not going to challenge their own scientists. Strong did this deliberately. I've talked to people that talked with him and knew all about it. And so, as I said, this link here is very, very important. Okay. And here's the most important thing, and I've just preamble to this. I used to think government inquiries were great ideas. Fabulous. Hey, yeah, finally get the politics out of the damn issue. Until I got appointed to my first commission of inquiry. And it was over a lake in Canada, and great conflict over it. And the minister said, would you serve on the commission? Yeah, fine. When we got the terms of reference, they were so written that there was only one conclusion we could reach. It's through the terms of reference that the politicians and the bureaucrats direct. This is what Strong did here, because this is the definition of climate change given to the IPCC. A change of climate which is attributed directly or indirectly to human activity. In other words, don't go looking at that natural stuff. We don't want any of those, get that sun out of here. We don't want to talk about the sun. We only want to look at human causes of climate change. And the public, most of the public think that they're still looking at total climate change. That's the deception. And of course, the IPCC makes sure that they don't get to know that. Okay, I wanted to show you this graph because it's actually from Stephen Schneider, who of course is very central to this whole climate scam business. And it's a systems diagram of atmospheric processes, and it shows you how complicated the situation actually is. When you look at all of this, I don't know, 5,000, 6,000 pieces that make up the complexity of what creates weather and climate, and they focused on CO2. Okay, so they pick one gas out of the whole thing and so virtually ignore everything else. Next slide. Here's the forcing diagram, and it doesn't matter if you can't read. You never read fine print in your life anyway, so why start now? But this is the forcing diagram of the IPCC. This is the 1995 report. And I mentioned to Tony, the 1990 report was not unreasonable. The real political influence came with the 1995 report. That's when they started to really control things. And you see here listed, there are 11 variables. And of course, those are just the human variables. And I described this as they've got a 5,000 piece puzzle, and they say they've solved the puzzle with 11 pieces. Isn't that remarkable? Well done. And of course, one of the things, well, we go to the next slide. This is the same slide in the AR5 report. But what I want you to notice over here on this side, this column says LOSU, which is level of scientific understanding. There's 11 of them there, only 2 are high. All the rest are medium or low. So the 11 that you're looking at, you don't know much about. And that hasn't improved much here into the AR5. Okay. Just very quickly, of course, to focus on CO2. This is the total atmosphere. That's the greenhouse gases in yellow. Here it's expanded to 100%. This is the CO2, the 4% of natural CO2, and that's the portion of it that's the human portion. So you start to get an idea of the scale or the dimension of what we're looking at here. And we can see it on the next graph in a more dramatic way. Here you can see CO2, methane, and of course the 95% that's water vapor. What they've done from the start, you say, well, humans produce water vapor, but the amount we produce is so small relative to the total amount of water vapor in the atmosphere, we just ignore it. But the gentleman here mentioned that it varies from 1 to 4%, and in fact, you've only got to vary water vapor in the atmosphere by 1%. It equals all of the effects of CO2. But you've already taken that out of the equation when you're looking at this particular graph. Okay, so we got a hypothesis. They created a hypothesis, anthropogenic global warming. Again, keep going. The assumption is that, or the hypothesis is only as good as the assumptions that you make for it. And they assume that CO2 is a greenhouse gas. And as we've already discussed, I'm somewhat cynical about that. Certainly cynical about the amount of greenhouse gas that it is. And they assume that a CO2 increase causes a temperature increase. I'll show you a graph in a minute which questions that. Okay, Nick. So what they said that CO2 will increase because of human industry. So they built into their assumption what will prove what they want it to prove. So they've said that humans are going to keep producing CO2 and therefore the level of CO2 in the atmosphere will continue to increase no matter what else happens. Ignore any natural variability. They've taken that out of it with this particular assumption. This, of course, is the ice core graph, or Antarctica. I remember when this came out in 1991, and Pettit and Jowsell, and they held a press conference about it. And Jowsell said, hey, don't rush to judgment on this. He said, you know, you got an 8-centimeter graph of 420,000 years. And not only that, but we've smoothed it with a 70-year smoothing average. We've taken all the variability out of it. So you really can't determine much from it. It wasn't but 5 years later that Fisher and others showed that the temperature was changing before the CO2, not as had been assumed in their, you know, that CO2 causes temperature increase. Okay, this is a presentation, John Christie's presentation to the U.S. Congress, and of course I think Tony already showed this graph. This is the actual balloon and satellite observations, and this is the average of the models. And what happened after the 1990 report, and I remember this being discussed, their predictions were out by 400% in the first 5 years. And so they stopped calling them predictions and started calling them projections and scenarios. And you'll see that moving the goalpost goes on all of the time. Okay. I wanted to show you this particular graph because this shows, and this is part of what Tony showed, the temperature increasing up to about 2000 and then leveling off and declining. Notice that in this portion it's called global warming after it becomes climate change. Now the reason I know that was because one of the great thrills of my life to be mentioned on the front page of the Times in England, but it was as a climate change denier. Okay, so I take credit wherever you can get it.
Tim, before you leave that slide.
Sorry?
Tim, before you leave that slide,
yeah.
1998
Yes.
features prominently.
Yeah, yeah.
Now, you'll notice, remember those who saw me on Q&A with Brian Cox, I pointed out two things. The 1930s in his graph had been reduced in temperature. Tony confirmed that. I also pointed out that 1998 had been eliminated. And that means it produced a complete warming, that's all it was. Cox's graph was a phony complete. They reduced the most prominent temperature in the last 20 years. The last, how many years?
Yeah. Okay, the other thing is, of course, that what caused their problem here was that the temperature started to level off, but CO2 continued to increase, in complete contradiction of their hypothesis. And as Huxley said over 100 years ago, the great tragedy of science is a lovely hypothesis destroyed by an ugly fact. And this was their ugly fact. But instead of going back and looking at their science and saying the science is wrong, they moved the goalposts. They started calling it climate change instead of global warming. And that was deliberate, because if you click again, you'll see here, this is a 2004 leaked email from the ClimateGate emails. Okay, from Menz at the Tyndall Center. He said, in my experience, global warming, freezing is already a bit of a public relations problem. Okay, so already the public are starting, because you had a few cold winters, right? And see, where's that global warming you promised us? And of course, I had to tell people that global warming was just another undelivered government promise. But then Swedish chief climate negotiator Bo Yellen replied, I agree with Nick that climate change might be a better labeling than global warming. So they knew what was going on. This is all worked out and planned out. Go ahead. Okay, I'll just show you this very quickly because this one for the public is so important. This is the ice cores. This is Ali's plot of the ice cores. Here's the current temperature over here. Here's the little ice age, the medieval warm period. And so you can quite show with this that about 95% of the last 10,000 years has been warmer than today. And that absolutely shocks people to find that. And we talk about empirical evidence because this photograph is from Hubert Lamb's volume 2. It's a Picea glauca. We click the next one. It's a white spruce. It's 100 kilometers north of the current tree line. And for a tree of that dimension to grow at that latitude, and you can see here what I did was I plotted, it's radiocarbon dated at 5,000 years, and there you can see that global temperatures were at least 2 to 3 degrees warmer than at present. And if you know I've done a lot of studies on the trees at the tree line. I mean, you can get a tree right at the tree line today that's about, maybe that size. It's 120 years old. You need a microscope to see the tree ring growth. So this is empirical evidence that the Earth was much warmer in the past. Okay. They built in, this is from Agenda 21, Principle 15. And it is essentially a catch-all. You remember that earlier thing I showed you about they decide when there's a problem and they decide when you've reached the limits? Well, this is Principle 15. In order to protect the environment, the precautionary approach will be applied by states according to their capabilities. So, of course, that's that socialist idea. Well, we'll make the rich pay and the poor don't have to pay. And where there are threats of serious or irreversible damage, lack of full scientific certainty shall not be required. I don't fess with facts. We'll decide what's appropriate, right? And shall not be used as a reason for postponing cost-effective measures to prevent environmental degradation. This, of course, is the precautionary principle built into, in bureaucratic terms, put into the Agenda 21. And it just allows them to do whatever they want. They decide when there's a problem, and it's built there. I mentioned in my earlier comments about the Yale study. This is the grading of public knowledge of climate change, and you can see here that 77% failed the test. And it was really, the results are quite shocking. But it's why, of course, that the public simply say, I don't understand it, so I'm not worried about it. Okay, this is the most important quote. I put it on the back of both my books now. This is Klaus Eckert Pulse, and he says, 10 years ago, I simply parroted what the IPCC told us. One day, I started checking the facts and data. First, I started with a sense of doubt, but then I became outraged when I discovered that much of what the IPCC and the media were telling us was sheer nonsense, was not even supported by any scientific facts and measurements. To this day, I still feel shame that as a scientist, I made presentations of their science without first checking it. And of course, that speaks to the fact that when they say, well, there's 97% of scientists agree. No, 97% of scientists have never even looked at their science reports. Because the minute they look at them, they're stunned. And Tony mentioned Harrison Schmitt. I happen to be lucky enough to be invited to speak to his breakfast table in Washington when he started looking at this stuff, and he had a whole group of engineers around the table. They could not believe what they were hearing and seeing with regard to this climate science. Okay, this is my hero, Václav Klaus, Czech Republic leader, the only world leader that spoke out. He spoke at the first Heartland Conference on Climate in New York, and his opening comment was, we've just gone through 70 years of communism. Why the hell would you want to go back to that? The room erupted. The room absolutely erupted. And of course, he wrote a actually difficult to get a hold of book now, and it speaks to Malcolm's point, Blue Planet in Green Shackles. I love that title. And of course, notice, what is endangered? Climate or freedom? And I think Viv would speak to that. Okay. I'll just finish up with my own advertising. This is the first book I brought out, The Deliberate Corruption of Climate Science. I held off on it for 20 years because I knew the public were not ready. And even now, a lot of the public find it a hard slog. But I had to have it with enough footnotes and details to deflect a lot of the academic criticism, because that's where the worst attacks come from. It's the people, the academic world. This is the one I just brought out. It's about 100 pages, nice pocket edition, and hopefully will help people as they start to listen to what Tony's saying and what Malcolm is doing. Human-caused global warming, the biggest deception in history. And I've done it in a journalistic way, the who, what, where, why, how, and when this thing was achieved. And that's basically what I've summarized for you here. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Professor Ball. I'll kick off some Q&A with a question from Facebook, from Sam Bucks, to Malcolm, actually. Why are you opposed to renewable energy?
Because they're not justifiable in science, They're not justifiable in economics. They're killing jobs, and they're hurting our whole civilization, and they're hurting our country. That's why.
And over to the audience, please.
Hi, Troy, ACT Climate Skeptics, volunteer Knights of Malta. Great presentations. Just want to ask one question first and make a point. When will funding to our research institutions be based on empirical, measured evidence, experiments based on the scientific method and established laws of physics, etc., and rather than models and projections? And the point I want to make is that nobody really talks about religion these days, but I think this area should unite all the world's religions, because each one of them had a human representative. And when you demonise carbon dioxide, you demonise that representative. I think it's blasphemous. Thank you.
No, nothing to say. That's good. Thank you.
I will add something to that, Troy, and that is that civilization, human civilization in particular, has never seen what has occurred, never seen before what has occurred in the last 150 years, 160 years. The dramatic lifting of billions of people from poverty and from the vulnerability of nature's extremes. Remarkable. And people now can thank cheap energy for our survival, for our safety, for our security, for our comfort, for our ease, and for our communication. Every single thing in this room, every single thing in our body has come out of the ground, and every single thing has been touched by one of two products, either coal or oil. Everything. Metal trucks, metal implements harvest our food, plant our crops, and then transport our crops, process our crops, and build our refrigerators and ovens. Coal has done so much to save this planet. 160 years ago, before the cheap use of coal, we were cutting down trees to provide energy and heat. In 1826, Sydney celebrated opening Australia's first street lamp network, powered by whale oil. We were slaughtering whales off Tangalooma, near where I live, in Brisbane. We were slaughtering them off the coast of New South Wales. Tim Ball has told me that the developed continents in the last 100 years have increased the area of forests by 30%.
Yeah.
30%, thanks to coal and oil. The whales are now increasing thanks to coal and oil. And it's very, very simple what coal and oil and natural gas do for our humanity. Because when we decrease the price of our energy, we actually then increase our productivity. When we increase our productivity, we increase our prosperity. When we increase our prosperity, we can afford two things. We afford many things, but two are important. We can afford to have leave and take annual leave. Then we go into the beaches and into the forests and other places. And if we see oil on the beach, we are angry. We actually can afford to then start caring for our environment. And these mad Greens, these mad, despotic, control freak Greens don't understand that simple thing. The environment, for the future of our environment, which we all care about, and Tony might talk more about this, the future of our environment depends upon the future of our civilization. Without civilization, we destroy the environment. And without the environment, we destroy our civilization. They're not mutually exclusive like the Greens would tell us. It's environment or civilization. It's environment with civilization and civilization with the environment. I am tired of these bullies and liars destroying humanity. So what we have to do is to start getting some of our coal industry executives to actually stand up and tell the truth. We have to get the CFMEU to stop supporting claims of global warming being caused by us. They are destroying their coal miners' members' jobs. They are thieves, they are bullies, and they are liars. And we in this room and outside have to stand up and start telling the truth. Tim Ball has come all the way from Canada. Coal and cheap energy are absolutely essential for civilization and for protecting our environment. End of story. Do you want to make comments on environmentalism?
I've been a very active environmentalist my entire life. I testified at a congressional hearing when I was 14 years old in support of a wilderness area in Utah. I fought very hard for the Clean Air and Water Act. I volunteered as a wilderness ranger for 2 summers in the mountains of New Mexico. I'm a full-time bicyclist. I will never get in a car unless I have absolutely no other choice. I hate driving. I'd love to see 90% of the cars off the road as a bicyclist. You know, I'd love to have much less pollution when I'm riding my bike to work, and I promote on my blog and on Twitter mass transit, and I'd love to see a lot more mass transit back in Colorado. So I'm very active about this. But like Malcolm said, Senator Roberts said, was that you know, it is the fossil fuels, it is the coal, oil, and natural gas that keeps our environment clean now. We would be a complete mess without it. And I always tell people, we got all these keep it in the ground idiots back in the United States. If we actually did what they said, if the oil companies actually did what they said and just quit delivering oil for a week, I mean, it would be mass chaos, and these people would be, they would be cured of their insanity about this climate change thing. And some days I wish they would just do it for a week, and it would be the end of this scam.
Just 3 quick points. One is there is a very deep-seated anti-humanity in the environmental movement, and you can read about that in several different places. I joke, and I've got to be careful now because one flippant comment got me a lawsuit, but I joke about, I'm familiar with that attitude because at the university my colleagues used to say if we could just get rid of all the students, it'd be a great place to work. So I'm familiar with that, get the people off the planet. The second point that I want to make is that contrary to everything you're being told, that with development, the population declines. It's called the demographic transition, and it's been known about since the 1940s. And in fact, we hear about all this overpopulation, but in fact, the developed countries have serious problems of population growth. They're offsetting it with migration. That's masking it a bit, but countries like Japan that do not allow migrants in are in quite serious trouble in terms of turning their population graph upside down. So there's that. That's the second aspect of it. And you look at countries like Italy that are offering the families for having a 3rd child. Quebec, they're even more racist about it. They offer money to families having a 3rd child, but only if you're French Canadian. So it's very, very interesting, that whole idea. But the fact that with development you actually achieve the population control that you want makes it completely contradictory.
We have a question from the audience.
Oh, Judy, thank you for your emails, by the way.
Can you hear me? My question, Dr. Tim. Oh, first of all, my name's Judy Ryan, and I've been a skeptic of global warming and climate change for 6 years. And that's right. So I've been working as a volunteer for the Galileo movement for 6 years. So my question is actually about the graph and what happened in 1998 when global warming changed into climate change, because the graph showed that something big happened in 1998, or because the lines each side of it were much smaller than the big wide line in the middle. So what actually happened? We were all alive then. Did we notice anything?
Well, there was you know, the Earth cooled from the 1940 to the mid-1970s, and then we had this PDO shift, Pacific Decadal Oscillation, which started things warming back up again in 1976, 1977. And then in 1998, there was a huge El Nino, which was the largest one until the one that happened this past year. So we had a big spike in temperatures. And since then, I'm not a climate expert by any stretch of the imagination. My understanding is that just oceanic cycles have not been the same that what caused the warming prior to 1998. So.
Just very quickly, the El Nino was the major factor there. The oceans, of course, have essentially been ignored. One of the difficulties when they first brought the satellite in, they were bouncing, trying to get temperature off the surface, and they discovered they were actually only measuring a few molecules at the top of the surface. But I think the oceans are a huge factor in global climate. I add them into the water vapor in the atmosphere. And I've long had a campaign to change the name of the planet from Earth to water, because with the oceans and then with the water in the atmosphere, those are the two. What they really do is they tend to modify. So if you go into the middle, well, Alice Springs, for example, you get a very wide range of temperature, right, day, night, and seasonally. But as soon as you start bringing in water vapor, it lowers the maximums and raises the minimums. And you can see that everywhere. So the water vapor in the atmosphere and the temperature, and just to be a name dropper for a minute, and whenever I say that, my mother's favorite joke was that how she was just telling the Queen how much she hated name droppers. But Hubert Lamb said to me that, you know, that there are ocean currents where you can have huge amounts of energy stored for up to 10,000 years before it circles and emerges at the surface. And that is more than enough to influence global temperatures. So until we get a full handle on not just the surface circulation this way, but the deep ocean circulation this way, we're really not going to get a grasp on what's actually happening with temperatures.
Yeah, let me throw in too. I was very good friends with Dr. Bill Gray, who passed away recently. And he spent a lot of time teaching me about that, about how thermohail changes and thermohailing in the oceans are affecting ocean circulation. And he was a very strong believer that all of the temperature changes were driven by changes in salinity, which caused these things we call PDO, AMO, things like that.
Can I, Judy? Judy, can I make a point? I think you were asking something a little bit more subtle as well as that. I think you said something about we all survived 1998.
Well, yes.
And we didn't even notice it at the time.
We didn't notice it at all. No.
Yeah.
And Malcolm, can I add to that? The polar bears survived that 10,000 years of warmth. The last doing very nicely.
And I'd like to introduce Peter Bobroff, if he could stand up, please. Again, because Peter has put together a website compiling the empirical evidence behind this document, some of the empirical evidence behind this document to the CSIRO. And I can't give you a direct link to it. Perhaps Peter could tell us the link, but maybe we can put it on Facebook. Or you can contact our office and we'll give it to you. But go there. There is a phenomenal amount of empirical data that's presented by Peter in graphical form. He's scraped many websites for the data and it's presented there, as I said, in graphical form. And Peter has been awarded an Order of he's become a member of the Order of Australia for his services to research. He's a scientist and an engineer and has many, many years' experience in research as well as practical engineering. So that evidence is completely backed up there. And correct me if I'm wrong, Peter, your graph on ocean temperature shows cooling.
Hold on a sec.
The classic one was CSIRO put up a graph showing ocean heat content rising in the last couple of decades. And it only took a little bit of digging, and I think it was a paper in Nature, or Rosenthal 2013 or something like that, dropping another name, that showed we're at the lowest for 9,000 years. And that happened all the way through the little bits of evidence they provided. I mean, I suspect that they thought they were talking to the Michelego Ladies Climate Auxiliary or something instead of Senator Roberts.
Next question, sir.
Hello, my name is Jim Sternhell. The alarmists love to go on about the 97% consensus that appeal to authority, but to me appears to be just a semantic manipulation. The most comprehensive of those consensus things, of course, was the Cook et al. From 2013 with 11,944 abstracts reviewed. Just 64, according to them, but reviewed to 41, came to a quantified conclusion that humans were the dominant cause of global warming / climate change. With such a tiny number, has anyone looked at the actual number of lead authors and who peer reviews those tiny numbers that give that so-called consensus conclusion that the alarmists love to bang on about all the time, and that to them is the closing argument, oh, the science is settled?
The only thing I can tell you is that that 97% was so quickly discredited and at Queensland and John Cook and all of that, that nobody bothered to go near it. The one that preceded it that actually had the initial impact was Naomi Oreskes' 95%. And what she did was, and students understand this, she did a Google search. And she just put in global warming and, of course, got 985 papers that all agreed that global warming was a problem. And then when you added one word to her Google search and the numbers changed completely. But Oreskes is an advisor to Obama's White House, and she has a huge amount of influence. But the consensus argument is another example of what Tony was talking about earlier. Consensus is a political term. It has nothing to do with science, but the public don't really understand that. They're overwhelmed by, and you notice Obama's been using it 97%, but then he talks about carbon, which is a solid, when he really means CO2, which is a gas. So what does he know?
Michael Crichton said the word consensus is the last refuge of scoundrels. It's a way to avoid debate. And about the 97% thing in Obama made a tweet a couple years ago. It said 97% of the world scientists believe that global warming is real, man-made, and dangerous. Complete nonsense. The American Meteorological Society did a survey of their professional members in 2013. Only 52% would even say that global warming was primarily man-made. Among professional forecasters, it was something like 38%. And of course, they never ask in these surveys any questions about is it dangerous, because they would probably get laughed out of the room if they asked anything that ridiculous. So that these numbers are utter nonsense. And no group in the American Meteorological Society, even the people who get paid to push global warming, was as high as 97%. So the number is a complete fake.
And Jim, that 97%, of course, when you look at the actual figures as you've done, and that 41, I think it was, or 44, when there were some appeals to some of the people who'd been attributed to saying that, and it's goes, no, that's wrong. It was downgraded to 41, just 41 out of 11,944. And that represents 0.3%, which is, instead of a 97% consensus, we've got a 0.3% smattering. But there's an even more telling figure. Not one of those 0.3% has ever provided any empirical evidence that carbon dioxide from human activity affects the global climate. Not one. That's the end of their story.
Thank you.
We have a special question from our media advisor, Sean Black.
Thank you, Malcolm. I just thought I'd let you know that we've reached about 50,000 people on Facebook so far, and we've got over nearly 700 comments with 200 shares. So we're getting out to a very big audience, and it's really good that we're able to use this technology, and we thank everyone for coming along here to help make the event this evening. Malcolm, my question, the best question that I've had so far this evening, and all three of you might want to answer this one. If you're not an alarmist, how do you get up in the morning?
Well, I'm a pro-human. That's how I get up in the morning, because I want to create a better world for my kids.
Yeah, I'll just ring the bell on that question.
Sir.
Yeah, I'm Doug Cotton again. As part of, I guess, many thousands of hours of research that I've done, there's some very interesting information that I've concluded regarding natural climate cycles. I think people are more or less aware that it was warm in the Roman times and again in medieval and again now. We've got an underlying long-term 1,000-year cycle, but we've also got a superimposed 60-year cycle, and at the moment the long term is still going up, but there's reasons to believe it will start to turn down for 500 years around about the middle of this century. And at the moment the hiatus is basically the combination of the 60-year going down since 1998 and the long term still going up, and so we can expect the hiatus to continue to about 2028. Now, why is this so? What regulates these climate cycles? Well, there's an absolutely fascinating correlation between a particular graph that you can see at the top of my website, whyitsnotco2.com, which is derived from planetary orbits. Technically, it's the inverted plot of the scalar sum of the angular momentum of the sun and all the planets. And it exhibits a 934-year, because I can calculate it very precisely, 934-year cycle and a superimposed 60-year cycle. And sure enough, it starts to turn down after 2050, 2058 or so. And we can expect, as they say, the people that derive this, another little ice age, basically starting about the year 2400 AD.
Perhaps Tim would be the best to answer that question.
I'm going to put this in the historical context of what's happened in climate science. In 1990, there was a conference in Poland in which the Western world, because the Cold War was going on at that time, the Western world again and the Eastern world. I had been working with Borisenkov, the Soviet climatologist, on the Russian chronicles, and I'd also worked with Chinese climatologists because China wanted to increase its food production, and it was already close to maximum in the southern part of China, getting 3 crops out of a field in a year. So they saw Manchuria as the potential. They decided if they sent their climate experts to Canada, they could learn how we produce food with the same kinds of climate conditions. But the conference in Poland split because the Russians and the Chinese were saying that the climate is cyclical. But all you have to be able to do is sort out all of these cycles and how they interact with each other to create the net effect that is ongoing climate. The Western world was in the throes of chaotic theory. And so they totally rejected the cyclical arguments for climate. The media interpreted that conference as being a political Cold War disagreement, but in fact it was a very fundamental climate disagreement. And ironically, the people that are using climate cycles now are people in the stock market, and they're using climate cycles that the Russians have used for years. There's a thing called the Kondratiev cycle, which is related to drought cycles in the middle latitudes and grain production, which affects the stock market. And a lot of people in New York are using that. But in the climate field, cyclical ideas are still not accepted, the focus, and that's the problem. The IPCC have stopped good climate research for almost 40 years now. We're here talking about CO2. We should be talking about all the other factors that can cause climate change. But because of what they've done, they've kept the focus too narrow. But I'm a cyclical man. I'm with you, by the way.
It's interesting because that was actually, I've read quite a bit of literature from the early 20th century, just talking about the eccentricity of the Earth's orbit and the other factors which affect climate, like you were discussing. And it was a very popular and maybe possibly one of the most widely believed theories until Arrhenius came along and messed up the whole thing with the CO2 thing around 1910.
Now, Milankovitch, by the way, which is the biggest one, the orbit change and tilt changes and so on. And I remember going to conferences, you didn't dare mention Milankovitch. And then at the first conference I recall where somebody mentioned Milankovitch and wasn't immediately attacked was 1989. So that's how recent that whole thing is. But to show you the other prejudices, I worked with Theodore Landscheid, who was doing barycentric studies, that whole thing. Yeah. And we were doing studies on the 22-year drought cycle in the middle latitudes. And I wrote an article for What's Up With That, and everybody's familiar with that website. Yes. And I mentioned Landscheid's name in it. And Anthony Watts came back and said, I will not publish your article. I will not allow that name on my website. And I said, what? He was a very good researcher. He did fabulous work. He said, no, he believed in astrology. That was his reason. And my response was, so did Newton and so did Kepler.
And Doug, there is something else to remember too.
But that's the kind of prejudices you're dealing with in the climate field. Yeah.
There is something else to add to that too, and that is that the empirical evidence shows that the production of carbon dioxide by human activity has no impact on the level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So even if carbon dioxide affects the climate, and it doesn't, then our activity doesn't affect the level in the atmosphere. And that's quite clear, and it's not only in the empirical evidence in the climate studies, it's shown up when you look at the use of hydrocarbon fuels, coal, oil and natural gas. They decreased in 2009 during the global recession after the global financial crisis. And yet the carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere continued increasing, even though we cut our use of hydrocarbon fuels. And that's really significant, because they're telling us we need a carbon dioxide tax to cut our fuel use so we can cut the level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Rubbish. The empirical evidence shows that's not happening. And it shows it can't happen, and we know why it can't happen. So cycles explain it.
Sorry, can we get one more question from the audience? I'm just cognizant that they've been standing up for quite some time. Just one more, please.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. No, we'll take all donations here. Yeah. Oh, yeah, okay. Yeah, no, thank you, Doug. Appreciate it.
Does this thing work? My name's John McRae. I was going to ask if the CSIRO was here, but I'm very disappointed they're not, because I wanted to know how much CO2's in the ocean and how it got there, and if we go swimming, are we going to end up with CO2 because it grows vegetation with tomato plants coming out of our ears? But what the point that everybody's missing here is what the agenda is, and it's money and tax. Now, Karl Marx said taxation is a political tool to suppress and control a country. First, we started off with carbon dioxide tax. Then we went to global warming. Now we're going to climate change. And what we've done here in this country, we passed a tax that I don't know if you people know, in 1953, where if you're investing, conducting business or manufacturing, you need not pay tax here, but tax in the country of origin. So we've deleted our money income. So now we introduced the GST, the grab, snatch and take, to equalise it up. Now we're going to equalise it again with either a carbon emission scheme or a CO2 tax. And it'll be a tax on a tax on a tax. And we're the highest tax country in the world, and it's going to spread everywhere. Now, I don't know what it's like in America, but here I could rattle off thousands of companies which I've witnessed that grew up were manufacturing in the 50s and 60s and 70s with coal. This building here wouldn't be here without coal. And I was a shift engineer in the coal mine, and Malcolm will tell you how many byproducts are out of coal. And we're awash with oil, coal and gas in this country. We've got 70 of the 75 minerals in Australia in abundance. And we're not utilising them. And we're not value adding them. But if we keep going with this climate business, it's going to be another tax to wipe out our secondary industry. And what are we going to do then? Where are we going to get employment? Where are we going to get the tax? How are we going to fortify our defence? How are we going to do infrastructure? And if we can equate that with America, with your taxation, like they're doing here with this carbon tax and emissions trading scheme, it's the same thing, same chocolate, different wrapper. And they've had 3 goes at it. First it started off with CO2, global warming, now climate change. I don't know which one they want.
So, you guys have any comments on that?
I can comment, John, on carbon dioxide tax in this country. We all know that Julia Gillard brought in the Gillard Greens carbon dioxide tax based on a lie. She was punished for that when Tony Abbott stood up next to Greg Hunt, the then shadow spokesman for environment and responsible for the climate change scam, or climate change scare as it was in those days, and they promised they would remove the carbon dioxide tax. Abbott duly did that. And within a month of him getting the flick, Greg Hunt, as the Environment Minister under Malcolm Turnbull, pushed through the lower house, and in the last day of sitting in December of 2015, pushed through the carbon dioxide tax through the Senate with the help of the Labor Party and the Greens, They've called it a safeguard mechanism. Greg Hunt was bragging about the fact that his direct action plan could be linked to an international carbon dioxide price. We have a carbon dioxide tax in place now as a result of Greg Hunt's activities. We have a carbon dioxide tax in place now. It is linked, it can be linked easily to an international price, which means that the price of our energy, which governs our prosperity, will be linked and determined by an international market. But it's not a market in the traditional sense because it doesn't meet any need. It is a tax, pure and simple. And what is more disgraceful, no, it's not more disgraceful, it's not as disgraceful, is 150 CEOs have not been talking about it. But they limit, under the scheme, they limit the amount of carbon dioxide that is being produced. There are penalties if they are exceeded, and there are credits if they go under. That is an emissions trading scheme which Tony Abbott quite rightly called a carbon dioxide tax. We have one in place here from the party that promised to remove it. We can't keep accepting this.
We'll wrap up the session shortly. If I could ask, going from the right, from my right to the and finishing up with Malcolm, what would be your key takeaway point for tonight, Professor Ball?
My key takeaway point? I think the fact that we've got the evidence that Tony presents of people deliberately manipulating a record, and my explanation of why they're doing it, the motive behind it. And I think you put those two things together, you've got all that you need in a court of law to prove that there's criminality. And I think if we get that message out, and then the public will shift off of climate change being their least concern to the manipulation of climate change being their top concern. And I think that's what our objective is.
Thank you. And Mr. Heller, what would be your key takeaway?
Well, I would make my response a little more general based on yesterday and today. You know, we've presented some very important information, and I noticed a lot of the news reports that were coming out of yesterday's event were completely misrepresentative and biased. And we depend in a free society on having an open and honest press corps who tells the truth about things, reports on both sides, and allows an honest discussion. The public depends on it. And I would just make an appeal to people in the press to please stop misrepresenting what we're saying. Please let us speak for ourselves. Let's have this debate and show both sides, because all of our societies, Australia, United States, all free societies depend on having an honest press corps, and we need to return to that.
And Senator, yep. And Senator Roberts, your key takeaway?
Let's start with the taxpayer-funded ABC. We should start. I'd like to make one simple comment and then finish with another comment. We are facing a $1 trillion industry. $1 trillion industry. Very powerful, wanting to rip us off and control us. However, we have something that they haven't got. We've got two things they haven't got. We've got the truth, and we've also got something called love. There are many people in this room who have given up years of their lives, years, and given up some of their careers, and so have their spouses. And without our spouses, people could not have done this. I look at Judy Ryan and what she's been doing in Canberra, and it's astounding. And I want to finish by celebrating humans, because this is an issue of control versus freedom, and humans are entitled to be free. We are born to be free, and we need to celebrate humans. We are the most special species on this planet. We need to celebrate it, recognize it, and share it. And we need, above all, to speak up, to share the news that you've heard from these two wonderful gentlemen who've come from so far away, and share this and celebrate humanity. And thank you very much for coming.
Please, yeah, thank you. That concludes the evening. If you'd like to, actually, if you would applaud one more time, not only for this excellent panel we had tonight, but for a lot of the people who've been fighting this fight alongside the people up here as well. If we can all...
And also Darren for Sean, who's organised the night. Darren, yourself, Boston, who's been going through hell in the last 2 days to learn and has done a remarkable job. David, Danielle, Leon, right here, an amazing job, and Robin back in Brisbane. Thank you very much for putting this on. And Paul back in Sydney, who's been working for the last couple of hours behind the scenes. Thank you, mate.